Brace yourselves, because we're going to do a story about journalism at the European Union. And do not adjust your sets. Brussels, the EU's de facto capital, has one of the largest press corps in the world, 1,300 strong. However, the mainstream reportage from there seems to fail to hit home with news audiences. With 28 member states, 24 languages, and a legendary bureaucracy, the EU is neither simple nor exciting to cover. But think of the story there. Polls now say that the EU's popularity is at an all-time low, and the refugee crisis has laid bare the Union's weaknesses, its inability to impose its core values on member states. The problem with the journalism is that the reporters assigned to cover EU institutions tend to bring a lot of national baggage with them in the form of biases, and the journalism can be hijacked by polemics. But there's a new kid in town. Politico, the Washington, D.C.-based political news site, has landed in Brussels, and it's trying to shake things up. The Listening Post's Paolo Ganino now from Brussels on the challenges of covering the European Union.
EU migrants grab our jobs. Who will speak for England? Queen backs Brexit. There's a movement behind these headlines, known as Euroscepticism, and it's particularly relevant in Great Britain right now.
Facts about the UK's relationship with the EU seem hard to find.
Next month, when Britons go to the polls to decide whether the UK should stay in the EU, they will have seen plenty of those kinds of stories.
Campaign, you're going to hear all sorts of claims and counterclaims and even the odd bit of dodgy information.
Covering Brexit is especially complicated because you have an extremely competitive media market in the UK, especially in the print sector, and so the tone of coverage is aggressive, and journalists are even more inclined to push conflict and leave little room for reflection that takes into account both sides.
The thrust of British coverage on Europe seems to be to sort of err on the hysterical as opposed to the well-informed. If you send someone here and your mandate is, let's find the most ridiculous thing and blow it up into a story, it's not that hard. If you send someone to cover Whitehall and say, okay, your mandate here is to find the stupidest thing the British government is doing on any day, you would find a lot of stupid things. But it doesn't mean that you actually understand whether this is a sound policy or not a sound policy. And that's the kind of coverage that's been missing here.
The UK is not alone. On the continent, coverage of the EU is often more parochial than pan-European. Most news outlets see the EU story through a domestic lens, focusing on what the EU's policies mean for a particular country rather than for the Union itself. The recent authoritarian drift in Poland, in defiance of the EU's core values, did make some headlines in neighboring countries like Germany, but tapered off almost immediately. And with a few exceptions, the mainstream media failed to cover the European angle of the story.
Many journalists, politicians, critics have discussed how media freedom in Poland might be endangered due to the new Polish government, but very often there's only a short attention span. Many people from inside the media, from politics, also from academia, keep on asking for a pan-European medium for years now, saying there's no European audience and we need to create one.
The German newspapers, like the Frankfurter Allgemeine and Süddeutsche Zeitung, and also the public service television, like ARD and ZDF, cover the European Union as an autonomous center of power, rather than as a story about what can we get out of the European Union. It's quite remarkable that even in countries like Italy, France, Netherlands, Spain, all of which, until very recently, had no Eurosceptic parties or movements, didn't develop a pan-European journalism.
The main reason why there is no pan-European media is mainly because of languages. And so here at Euractiv, we publish in 12 different languages. We actually have journalists on the ground which publish in their own language. They can take up the content that we produce here in English, and they then adapt it to their national audience. It means they can select the news that they think is relevant, and they can add a national flavour to it. On the same topic, there will be national sensitivities, which can be very, very different.
The space for pan-European journalism is very limited, as some have learned the hard way. The European tried in 1990, riding the wave of enthusiasm that followed the fall of the Berlin Wall. The weekly paper lost money for 8 years before shutting down. On the television side, there's Euronews. Based in France, it's controlled by an Egyptian media tycoon, Naguib Sawiris, and has also the backing of the EU itself, which pays for 1/3 of the operation. Euronews broadcasts in 13 languages but fails to attract an audience beyond business people and policy makers. Other pan-European publications online like Cafe Bubble, EU Observer and Euractiv operate in a niche market and rely on corporate sponsors and grants to survive.
They are writing for an elite who are interested in what happens in Brussels because very often it's their job, or they are interested academically, but they typically have relatively small audiences. For popular newspapers or even mid-market newspapers, it's very difficult indeed. And so far, all of the attempts to make a pan-European media which is outside of the charmed circle of the upmarket papers have failed.
Enter Politico Europe, an offshoot of the politics and policy website in the US. It's hoping to succeed where its pan-European predecessors have struggled or failed. Those outlets lacked a big brand name such as Politico's. It also helps to have financial backing, which Politico has through Axel Springer, the German media giant. Axel Springer is the publishing house behind Bild, Europe's biggest selling newspaper. They also own Die Welt, an influential broadsheet in Germany, and American news site Business Insider. Politico Europe is a joint venture, 50% of which is bankrolled by Axel Springer, which puts this media venture into a different category than any other pan-European media outlet.
Axel Springer said, let's try and join forces, come to Brussels, because there is an opportunity here. It's really quite amazing that no one has seen the opportunity, that there really was an open playing field. I mean, we're not trying to steal anyone's cake.
Politico has changed the media landscape here in Brussels quite radically because they have a big budget and because they came up with a big team of journalists. They came with mainly American reporters, American style of reporting, sometimes very aggressive, very personalized. And here in Brussels, it doesn't always work because this is not the way things happen over here.
It's amusing for me to hear some of the kind of very vague criticism, you know, you're sensationalist, you're superficial. There is a strain of tabloid in our approach. We've hired reporters from tabloid newspapers. They have a great nose for reporting. One of the dangers of political reporting in a place like Washington, which is the same danger as you have in Brussels, is that journalists become part of the establishment furniture. You know, you're close to your sources, they invite you over for dinner, you know them intimately, and you feel, well, I'm part of the ruling establishment here.
Coming from Politico, that's a bit rich, given that the main knock against its US operation is that it's too close to the power brokers in Washington, too detached from America's reality. Politico itself is not the cure for what ails journalism in Brussels, but the formula behind the site, outsiders, stateless, well-funded, might be just what the EU and the reporters covering it need. More, please.